The first shot was not ours. War had come to Telros 5, a backwater world on the edge of the galactic frontier. The Kroth Dominion had been expanding for centuries, their conquests swift and merciless. When they reached Earth's colonies, they expected another easy victory. They were wrong. General Vierokan of the Kroth Dominion stood atop a ridge, his black carapace gleaming under the twin suns. Below, his forces, tens of thousands strong, formed a perfect war formation, their massive war machines primed to crush resistance. The human outpost, a small military installation on the planet's surface, was laughable in comparison. A single orbital bombardment could erase them. A swift ground assault would mop up any survivors. This battle should have been over before it began. And yet, it wasn't. The humans had fortified their position beyond reason, layering defenses with almost obsessive paranoia. Every trench, every bunker, every turret was placed with surgical precision. Vierokan watched as their soldiers moved into position, quick, disciplined, unshaken by the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Then he saw them. The medics. Humans had dedicated battlefield healers, fragile, non-combatants who should have been far from the front. And yet, they moved among the soldiers not only carrying medical kits but weapons? Not just pistols. Not sidearms for last resort defense. Rifles. Grenades. Blades. They carried the same loadouts as the infantry, but with the unmistakable markings of battlefield medics. Vierokan frowned. This was not normal. No other species armed their healers. Medics were protected by universal war codes. They were non-combatants, expected to be left alone so they could tend to the wounded. So why were humans so different? Then the order came. Advance. The Kroth forces surged forward, war cries echoing across the battlefield as the sky darkened with artillery. The humans did not flinch. They fought like demons. The price of underestimation. The first wave should have broken the humans in minutes. It lasted 3 hours. The Kroth charged with overwhelming force, but the humans held. Their guns spat thunder, their artillery roared, their trenches swallowed entire battalions. Vierokan watched in disbelief as his elite forces, the same warriors who had crushed a dozen worlds, were cut down like cattle. But what unnerved him most were the medics. Whenever a human fell, they appeared, rushing through the chaos, dragging wounded soldiers to cover. But they did not cower. They did not hide behind their patients. They fought. A Kroth soldier lunged at a fallen human, aiming to finish the job, only to be blown apart by a shotgun blast from a combat medic. Another medic, blood smeared across his face, was treating a wounded soldier with one hand while unloading rounds with the other. Vierokan saw one of his warriors reach a wounded human, only for a female medic to drive a combat knife into his throat before tending to her comrade without missing a beat. This was madness. They weren't just healers. They were warriors. A battlefield of monsters. The Kroth forces continued to press forward, sending wave after wave of reinforcements. Their superior numbers should have overwhelmed the humans by sheer attrition. But they did not break. Vierokan's forces finally breached the first line of trenches, expecting scattered resistance. Instead they found a kill zone. The moment they stepped in, the humans unleashed hell. Hidden machine gun nests, concealed mines, explosive drones, all designed to funnel and butcher the invaders. And the medics? They were at the front. A wounded human collapsed, his armor shredded by plasma fire. A medic rushed to his side, yanking him into cover. Before administering aid, he turned and fired a burst straight into an advancing Kroth warrior's skull. Another medic was hit in the leg. He growled, pulled himself into a firing position, and gunned down the enemy before wrapping his own wound. This was not war. This was insanity. Vierokan's forces were superior in numbers, technology, and firepower. Yet for every Kroth warrior that fell, the humans got back up. The wounded should have been liabilities. Instead they became nightmares. His forces had fought armies that broke the moment their medics were slain. It was a simple strategy: take out the healers and the soldiers would crumble. But with humans it didn't work. Killing their medics didn't break them. It enraged them. Every fallen medic was avenged with brutal efficiency. The humans fought harder, their strikes more savage, their attacks more relentless. This was unlike anything Vierokan had ever seen. The Kroth had studied human warfare. They had prepared for their infantry, their armor, their pilots. But they had never prepared for this. The last stand of Vierokan. By the time night fell, half of Vierokan's army was dead. His forces had pushed the humans to their last defensive line, a fortified command post surrounded by automated turrets and thick barricades. If they broke through, the battle would be over. But at what cost? Virokin stood among his battered forces, staring at the battlefield. The ground was soaked in the blood of both sides. Smoke curled from burning wreckage. The groans of the wounded filled the air. The humans should have surrendered. No species fought this hard for one planet. And yet they still stood. He could see them preparing for the final assault. Their weapons were running low, their numbers dwindling. But they were ready. And at the center of it all, the medics. They tended to the dying, reinforced barricades and checked their rifles. The healers of humanity did not pray for salvation. They loaded their guns. Virokin exhaled, his mandibles clicking in frustration. This was no ordinary battle. This was an extinction event, for one side or the other. And for the first time in his long military career, he wasn't sure which. Then his communicator crackled. "General, we have intercepted a human transmission." Virokin gestured for his officer to patch it through. The voice of a human officer came through the static. "Hold the line. If they break through, we're all dead anyway. Medics, keep your guns hot. They don't get past us. Not today." Pause. Then a deep chuckle. "And if they ask why our medics carry guns?" Silence. Then a grim answer. "Because we don't like losing patients." Virokin's blood ran cold. This war was far from over. And for the first time in Kroth history, he was afraid. Virokin's mandibles twitched. The human transmission had ended, but its weight hung over him like a noose. Because we don't like losing patients. He had fought dozens of campaigns. He had crushed resistance on worlds that were built for war. But never, never, had he encountered an enemy that treated war itself as a battlefield surgery. Cold, precise, unrelenting. The humans were not just fighting. They were saving. Every single one of them fought like their comrade's life depended on it. Because it did. This was no simple conquest. This was survival. Virokin exhaled, claws tightening around his command staff. His forces were battered, but they still held the advantage. His war machines outgunned their defenses. His troops outnumbered them 5-1. And yet, he hesitated. The battlefield was a graveyard. Smoke curled from wrecked Kroth walkers, their hulking forms twisted by well-placed explosives. The bodies of his fallen troops were strewn everywhere. Dozens piled atop one another, burned, broken, shredded by relentless fire. The humans' casualties were fewer. Not because they were unscathed. Because their medics kept dragging them back from the brink. Every time a human should have fallen, there was a medic pulling them back, stitching wounds under gunfire, pressing trauma pads onto gaping injuries, keeping their soldiers in the fight. It defied logic. It defied war itself. His second-in-command approached, wiping crimson blood from his blade. "General," the warrior growled. "We have exhausted 3 waves. Our forces are fatigued. Shall we regroup?" Virokin clenched his jaw. Regrouping meant admitting the enemy was stronger than expected. It meant giving them time to reinforce. But charging meant throwing more troops into a battlefield that had already devoured thousands. A shudder passed through his ridged exoskeleton. Since when did war feel like a mistake? He lifted his communicator. "All units, press the attack." Storming the gates. The ground quaked as the Kroth launched their final push. Armored walkers stomped forward, plasma cannons glowing with the charge of annihilation. Elite troops, those who had survived the earlier slaughter, formed spearhead formations, moving with calculated efficiency. Their weapons were primed. Their blades were ready to carve through whatever remained of human resistance. And the humans? They were waiting. A crack of thunder. The first artillery strike slammed into the ground, vaporizing an entire Kroth unit in an instant. Snipers fired from hidden nests, punching through armored carapaces with lethal precision. Then the trenches exploded with movement. Human soldiers surged forward, guns roaring, not retreating but charging into the incoming horde. At the center of it all, the medics moved like ghosts. A soldier took a plasma shot to the chest. He should have been dead before he hit the ground. But before his body could crumple, 2 medics were there. One laid down covering fire, riddling the Kroth attackers with armor-piercing rounds. The other ripped open the fallen soldier's armor, sealing the wound mid-battle, injecting a stimulant to drag him back into consciousness. And the moment the soldier's eyes fluttered open, his rifle was back in his hands. He was back in the fight. Again. And again. And again. The Kroth killed them, but the humans refused to die. Virokin felt something deep in his core. A sensation he had never known in war. Panic. A reckoning in blood. The Kroth forces breached the final perimeter. At long last they were inside. A monstrous battle erupted in the heart of the human stronghold. Explosions turned cover into rubble. Close quarters combat raged in every corridor. Blades clashed against bayonets. Warriors tore into each other with primal fury. The humans fought like beasts backed into a corner. Because they were. A Kroth warrior lunged, expecting a broken, exhausted enemy. Instead he was met with a medic. The human was covered in blood, his own, his comrades', his enemies'. His uniform was scorched, his face bruised. He should have been tending to the wounded, cowering behind the front lines. Instead he gutted the Kroth with a combat knife. Another warrior rushed forward, only for the same medic to swing his rifle like a club, caving in the enemy's skull. Then, without missing a beat, he turned and started patching up a wounded soldier. Virokan watched, horror creeping into his bones. The humans were treating war itself as triage. One enemy down, stabilize an ally. Another enemy down, drag a comrade to safety. Every moment, every movement was about preservation. They weren't just trying to win. They were making sure their own would not fall. And that made them unstoppable. The general's final stand. The last Kroth troops fell, gunned down one by one. The battlefield was silent save for the crackling of fires and the groans of the dying. Virokan stood amidst the ruins of his forces, his blade dripping with human blood. He was alone. And the humans? They were still standing. A squad approached, battered, bruised but victorious. Their leader stepped forward, removing his shattered helmet. A combat medic. The man's face was smeared with dirt and blood, his uniform riddled with burn marks. A pistol hung loosely in his grip, still smoking from its last kill. And yet, despite all this, his other hand held a trauma kit. Yield, the medic growled. You're done. Virokan's claws flexed. His pride screamed for him to fight, to die in battle. But then his eyes flickered past the medic, to the battlefield of the dead and dying. And he saw something unthinkable. The human medics weren't just tending to their own. They were treating the wounded Kroth. Virokan's own soldiers. Those who had moments ago been trying to exterminate humanity, were being stabilized, bandaged, kept alive by the very people they had sworn to kill. He staggered. You save your enemies? He rasped. The medic didn't flinch. A soldier's a soldier. Doesn't matter whose side they're on. Virokan's mind reeled. This was not war. Not as he knew it. This was something else. And as the truth settled into his bones, his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, staring up at his conqueror. A human, a healer, and a warrior. His mandibles trembled as he whispered the last words of the Kroth Dominion. Why, do your medics carry guns? The medic's face was grim. Because we don't like losing patients. Then darkness took him. Virokan's body refused to move. His exoskeleton, cracked and bleeding, felt like it weighed 1,000 tons. His claws twitched feebly as he stared up at the human medic, the warrior mender who had undone an empire with both gunfire and bandages. His mind screamed at him to rise, to fight, to regain the honor that had slipped through his claws like sand. But his body knew the truth. The war was over. The human medic studied him for a long moment, his pistol still trained on Virokan's skull. Then, without a word, he holstered the weapon and knelt beside the fallen general. A gloved hand pressed against Virokan's chest. Not to strike, not to kill, but to check for a pulse. The sheer audacity of it sent a tremor through Virokan's exhausted frame. His enemy, the one who had slaughtered his warriors, shattered his army, was now tending to his wounds. This is not war. It was something far more terrifying. It was humanity. Patchwork on the battlefield. The battlefield reeked of blood and burning metal. Human medics moved through the carnage like grim reapers turned saviors, their boots crunching over the bodies of friend and foe alike. One by one they stabilized the wounded Kroth. Some of the fallen warriors hissed in confusion as hands wrapped their injuries in bandages. Others flinched as clotting agents were injected into their wounds, stopping fatal bleeding. Not all survived. But far more lived than should have. This was not mercy. This was pragmatism, a calculated refusal to let death claim a soldier just because they wore the wrong uniform. Virokan felt his consciousness waver. He wanted to protest, to demand an explanation for this madness. But all he could do was watch. Watch as the warriors of Earth, those who had just fought with savage, unrelenting brutality, moved with a gentleness that defied logic. They were killers and saviors in equal measure. And for the first time in his long blood-stained career, Virokan did not know how to fight against that. A general's dilemma. Hours passed. The fires of battle had cooled to embers. The wounded had been moved to makeshift triage zones, where human and Kroth alike were being treated side by side. Virokin sat against a piece of ruined Kroth armor, his arms bound with crude but effective medical wraps. His exoskeleton still ached, but his wounds had been treated. By a human. The medic who had saved him, Sergeant Calloway, he had heard the others call him, approached. He tossed a metal canister at Virokin's feet. "Drink," Calloway grunted. Virokin eyed the container warily. Calloway sighed, crouching down. "It's water, not poison." Virokin hesitated. Why would a victor share water with the defeated? And yet, the thirst in his throat burned like fire. With slow, deliberate movements, he lifted the canister to his mandibles and drank. The liquid was cool, clean, and utterly devoid of trickery. Calloway smirked. "See? Told you." Virokin lowered the canister. "Why?" he rasped. The medic's expression hardened. "Because you're not dead yet." Virokin exhaled sharply. It was an infuriating answer, yet it carried an undeniable weight. The humans had every reason to exterminate the remaining Kroth. And yet they had chosen otherwise. His mind churned, wrestling with the impossible contradiction. "If our positions were reversed," Virokin said at last, his voice low, "we would have slaughtered you all." Calloway didn't blink. "I know." Virokin narrowed his eyes. "Then why spare us?" The medic leaned forward, his voice a whisper of steel. "Because that's the difference between you and us." The word struck deeper than any blade. Virokin, the conqueror, the warlord, the executioner of planets, felt something he had never felt before. Shame. The end of the Kroth dominion. Virokin sat in silence as the weight of reality settled over him. His forces were broken. The Kroth dominion's invincible war machine had been halted, dismantled, and undone. Not just by superior strategy. Not just by firepower. But by an enemy that refused to play by the rules of war. The humans had fought harder, bled more, and sacrificed beyond reason. But more than that, they had done the unthinkable. They had refused to let war be the final truth. A sharp crackle echoed across the battlefield. A human officer's voice boomed over the comms. "All remaining Kroth forces, stand down. You are prisoners of war. Lay down your weapons and no harm will come to you. Any further resistance will be met with immediate and overwhelming force." Virokin heard distant shouts. The last remnants of his once mighty forces were surrendering. His mandibles clenched. He had fought so long, so hard for a war that was supposed to end all wars. Instead, he had led his people into humiliation. Calloway stood, dusting off his uniform. "This is where it ends, General?" Virokin looked up at the human medic. His conqueror. His savior. The war was over. But something told him. This was only the beginning. Virokin's claws tightened around the canister of water as reality settled upon him. The Kroth dominion was no more. The humans had shattered their war machine not with superior numbers, not with overwhelming technology, but with something far more alien to his kind. Restraint. They had crushed his armies, obliterated his warships, and annihilated his best commanders. Yet they refused to exterminate. They refused to erase the Kroth like the Dominion had done to countless species before them. Instead they offered prisoner status. A future. Virokin, the supreme commander of a fallen empire, did not know how to fight an enemy like that. And that terrified him more than any weapon ever could. A general without an army. The battlefield was now a sea of surrendered warriors. Thousands of Kroth sat in orderly clusters, their weapons discarded, their war machines gutted and powerless. Human soldiers patrolled among them, rifles slung across their backs, helmets removed. There was no mockery, no humiliation, no unnecessary cruelty. Only control. And Virokin knew what that meant. The humans weren't just victors, they were masters of war. A lesser species, having won such a decisive battle, would have paraded their captives, burned their cities, salted their fields. But humans did not seek dominance through destruction. They did something far worse. They refused to give their enemies a reason to hate them. "General." Virokin turned his head. Sergeant Calloway stood over him, his hands resting on his combat vest. "It's time," Calloway said. Virokin exhaled slowly. Time for judgment. Time to face the reality he had created. He pushed himself to his feet. His exoskeleton still ached, his body weak from battle and medical treatment alike. Yet the humans had made sure he could walk under his own power. Damn them for that. He would have preferred execution over mercy. But humans didn't care what he preferred. They only cared about what came next. The tribunal of the broken warlord. The makeshift war council had been assembled in what remained of an old Kroth command center. Its walls, once adorned with banners of conquest, now bore only the scorch marks of human bombardment. Vierokin stood before a panel of human officers. Not in chains. Not bound. The humans hadn't shackled him. They hadn't needed to. A prisoner only needed shackles if they still had something left to fight for. A human general sat at the center of the table, her face lined with the weight of command. General Yelena Voss. She studied Vierokin in silence before speaking. "The war is over," she said. No mockery. No triumph. Just a simple fact. Vierokin remained silent. "Your empire is gone," she continued. "Your people will be given a choice, to rebuild, to integrate, or to vanish into history as nothing more than a cautionary tale." Vierokin's mandibles twitched. "You would allow the Kroth to survive?" Voss's expression was unreadable. "We do not kill for sport, General." He let out a bitter laugh. "No. You kill with purpose." Voss nodded. "Exactly." Her eyes locked onto his, pinning him in place. "So the question is, what purpose do you have left?" Vierokin felt the weight of those words crush against his battered soul. His purpose had always been war. But now there was no war left to fight. The unthinkable offer. Calloway stepped forward, arms crossed. "I read your war history," he said. "You don't strike me as the type to rot away in a prison cell." Vierokin's claws flexed. "A prisoner is all I am now." Calloway smirked. "Not necessarily." Vierokin narrowed his eyes. Was this another trick? Voss leaned forward. "You know how your people think. You know their strategies, their ways of war. If the Kroth are going to survive, they'll need someone who understands how to rebuild from nothing." Vierokin sneered. "And if I refuse?" Voss's voice remained cold. "Then you will die forgotten. Your people will either learn to live without you, or they will tear each other apart in your absence." He wanted to reject her. To spit in her face, to curse these humans for their arrogance. But deep in his core, he knew she was right. The Dominion was gone. But the Kroth still existed. And without leadership, they would cannibalize themselves, turning into scattered war bands fighting over scraps of a once great empire. They would become prey. Slowly Vierokin exhaled. He hated that humans had forced him to see the truth. He hated that they had beaten him so completely, not just on the battlefield but in ideology. He hated that he was about to say the words that followed. "What do you want me to do?" "A different kind of war." A slow, knowing smile crossed Calloway's face. Voss nodded. "Help us stabilize what's left of the Kroth. Help us prevent another war before it starts." Vierokin let out a bitter chuckle. "So, I am to become a tool for my conquerors." Voss shrugged. "If that's how you see it." Or, her eyes gleamed. "You could see it as the first step in ensuring your species has a future." Vierokin's mandibles clicked softly. He had lived his entire life believing that war was the only path to survival. But humans had proven him wrong. They had won without erasing their enemies. They had crushed his empire, yet offered him the chance to build something new. For the first time in his existence, Vierokin faced a war he did not understand. The war for the survival of his people. And he had a choice. To die with the past. Or to forge a future. Epilogue: The shadow of war, the dawn of something else. Vierokin stepped out into the ruined city, his gaze sweeping over the remnants of the battlefield. He watched as human medics tended to Kroth wounded. As human engineers helped rebuild what had been destroyed. As his people, defeated and broken, were given a chance to live. His mandibles clenched. Humans were monsters. But not because of their brutality. Not because of their strength. Because they knew exactly when to stop. And that made them the most dangerous warriors in the universe. The end. Fire that was intense. Want more? Hit that subscribe button. The war might be over but the story isn't. Stay tuned. Rocket fire.